The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists began gathering for the changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Marcus Chen, an ambitious young reporter for Channel 7 News, clutching his microphone with nervous excitement. This was his first big assignment covering the royal beat, and he was determined to make his mark in the competitive world of British journalism. Marcus had spent weeks preparing for this moment. He studied the traditions, memorized the protocols, and researched every angle he could find about the Queen's Guard. But there was something different about his approach today. His editor had given him clear instructions to find a story that would generate clicks and views. The traditional coverage of ceremonial duties wasn't enough anymore. Viewers wanted drama, conflict, and viral moments. Standing at his designated spot behind the rope barriers, Marcus watched as the guards took their positions. These were not ordinary soldiers playing dress-up for tourists. Each member of the Queen's Guard was a highly trained military professional, selected from elite regiments like the Grenadier Guards, Coldstream Guards, and Welsh Guards. They had served in combat zones around the world, from Afghanistan to Iraq, carrying out dangerous missions that required incredible courage and skill. The guard closest to Marcus stood perfectly still in his iconic red tunic and tall bearskin hat. His name was Sergeant James Morrison, though Marcus didn't know this yet. At 32 years old, Morrison had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, where he had received commendations for bravery under fire. He had saved the lives of wounded comrades, led successful operations against enemy forces, and demonstrated the kind of leadership that earned him rapid promotion through the ranks. But standing there in his ceremonial uniform, Morrison looked like nothing more than a tourist attraction to Marcus. The reporter had bought into the common misconception that these guards were simply performers, actors playing a role for the entertainment of visitors. He failed to understand that beneath the ornate uniform stood a warrior who had faced life-and-death situations that most people could never imagine. As the ceremony began, Marcus started his live broadcast. His cameraman, Dave, positioned himself to capture both the reporter and the guard in the same frame. The early morning light was perfect, and the backdrop of the palace provided exactly the kind of prestigious setting that would impress viewers back home. Marcus began with standard coverage, describing the pageantry and tradition. But as minutes passed, he found himself growing restless. The story felt flat, predictable. He glanced at his producer, Sarah, who was making gestures from behind the camera suggesting he needed to spice things up. The live viewer count on their streaming platform was decent but not spectacular. They needed something more engaging, something that would make people stop scrolling and pay attention. That's when Marcus made the decision that would change everything. He had heard stories from other reporters about how the guards were trained to remain completely motionless and silent, no matter what happened around them. Some journalists had tested this in the past, trying to get reactions from the guards for their reports. It seemed like harmless fun, a way to demonstrate the incredible discipline these soldiers maintained. Marcus stepped closer to the rope barrier, positioning himself directly in front of Sergeant Morrison. The guard's eyes stared straight ahead, looking through Marcus as if he didn't exist. His face showed no emotion, no acknowledgement of the reporter's presence. To Marcus, this seemed like an invitation to push further. The reporter began by asking simple questions, speaking loudly enough for his microphone to pick up clearly. He asked about the weather, about how long the guard had been standing there, about whether his feet hurt in those heavy boots. Morrison remained perfectly still, his breathing so controlled it was barely visible. His years of military training had prepared him for far worse distractions than an overeager journalist. But Marcus misinterpreted this professional discipline as a weakness. He saw the guard's silence not as strength and training, but as an inability to respond. In his mind, he was dealing with someone who was basically a living statue, powerless to react or defend himself. This perception would prove to be a dangerous miscalculation. The reporter's questions became more pointed, more personal. He started making comments about the guard's appearance, joking about the funny hat and the toy soldier outfit. He asked if the guard ever got tired of being a tourist attraction, if he felt silly standing there all day for people to take pictures with. Each comment was delivered with a smirk, as if Marcus was sharing an inside joke with his viewers at the guard's expense. Dave, the cameraman, began to feel uncomfortable. He had been in the news business for 15 years and had developed a good sense for when a story was crossing the line from journalism into something more questionable. The look in Marcus's eyes reminded him of a playground bully who had found an easy target. But the ratings were climbing, and Sarah was giving them thumbs up from her position behind the broadcast equipment. Sergeant Morrison heard every word, processed every insult. But his reaction wasn't what Marcus expected. Rather than being hurt or humiliated, Morrison felt something entirely different. He felt disappointment. Here was yet another person who looked at his uniform and saw only the surface, who failed to understand what it represented and what sacrifices had been made by those who wore it with honor. The guard's mind drifted briefly to his fallen comrades, soldiers who had died defending the very freedoms that allowed this reporter to stand here and mock military service without fear of consequences. He thought about the families he had comforted, the letters he had written to parents who would never see their children again. The weight of those memories made Marcus's petty insults seem almost trivial. As the reporter continued his commentary, more tourists began to notice what was happening. Some laughed along with Marcus's jokes, treating it like entertainment. Others looked uncomfortable, sensing that something wasn't quite right about the situation. A few recognized the disrespect being shown and began recording the interaction on their phones, though they weren't sure yet why they felt compelled to document what they were witnessing. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would expose not just the reporter's ignorance, but his fundamental misunderstanding of what real strength and character looked like. Marcus was gaining confidence with each passing minute. The live viewer count on their broadcast had jumped significantly, and comments were pouring in from people who found his approach entertaining. Some viewers were cheering him on, encouraging him to push the guard even further. The validation from his audience made Marcus feel like he was on to something big, a story that could make his career. He decided to escalate his tactics. Moving as close to the rope barrier as possible, Marcus began making exaggerated gestures while he spoke, waving his hands near the guard's face and making loud noises to try to provoke a reaction. He started telling jokes at Morrison's expense, treating the decorated soldier like a prop in his performance. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced to his audience, "we have here one of Britain's famous toy soldiers. Notice how he doesn't blink, doesn't move, doesn't even seem to breathe. I wonder if there's actually a real person under all that costume, or if it's just a very expensive mannequin." He chuckled at his own joke, clearly pleased with what he considered clever commentary. Sergeant Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The insult to his service and his brothers in arms was becoming harder to ignore, but his training held firm. He had faced enemy fire without flinching, had maintained his position under artillery bombardment, had kept his composure while watching friends die in his arms. A disrespectful reporter was not going to break his discipline. What Marcus didn't understand was that Morrison's silence wasn't weakness or inability to respond. It was a choice, backed by years of military discipline and a deep understanding of duty. The guard could have ended this humiliation at any moment, could have put the reporter in his place with a few well-chosen words. But doing so would have violated his oath, would have brought dishonor to his regiment and to the institution he served. The crowd around them was growing larger. Word was spreading through social media that something interesting was happening at Buckingham Palace. People were sharing videos of the reporter's antics, and the story was beginning to go viral. Some viewers found it hilarious, but others were beginning to express concern about what they were witnessing. Among the growing crowd stood Eleanor Whitfield, a 78-year-old woman who had lived through the London Blitz as a child. She had watched her city burn under German bombing raids, had seen neighbors lose everything, had experienced firsthand what it meant when brave soldiers stood between civilians and those who would harm them. Watching Marcus mock the guard made her blood boil. "That young man has no idea what he's doing," she whispered to her grandson, who had brought her to see the ceremony. "That soldier has probably seen more hardship and shown more courage than that reporter will ever understand." Her grandson, Michael, was a university student studying journalism. He was torn between his admiration for Marcus's boldness and his growing discomfort with the situation. Something about the scene felt wrong, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Marcus, meanwhile, was riding high on his perceived success. He had started doing man-on-the-street interviews with tourists, asking them what they thought about the robot soldiers and whether they found the whole ceremony ridiculous. Most people gave polite, diplomatic answers, but Marcus edited their responses in real time, highlighting only the comments that supported his narrative. "You see," he told his audience, "even the tourists think this whole thing is a bit silly. Here we have grown men playing dress-up, pretending to be important while contributing nothing meaningful to society. They just stand here all day looking pretty for the cameras while real people do real work to keep the country running." The irony of his statement was lost on Marcus. He failed to recognize that Sergeant Morrison had done more real work in defense of his country than most people would accomplish in several lifetimes. The guard had risked his life repeatedly, had made sacrifices that allowed people like Marcus to live safely and freely express their opinions, even when those opinions were ignorant and hurtful. Sarah, the producer, was monitoring social media, reactions in real time. The story was definitely gaining traction, but she was starting to notice a shift in the tone of the comments. Early responses had been mostly positive, but now she was seeing more criticism of Marcus's approach. Some viewers were calling it disrespectful, unprofessional, even cruel. "Maybe we should wrap this up," she suggested quietly to Marcus during a brief break in the live feed. "We've got good content, and it might be smart to end on a high note." But Marcus was too caught up in the moment to listen to reason. He was experiencing the rush that comes from being the center of attention, from having people hang on his every word. He had tasted viral fame, and he wanted more of it. "Are you kidding?" he whispered back. "This is gold. We're getting more viewers than we've ever had. I'm not stopping now." He returned to his position in front of Morrison and cranked up his performance even further. He started asking increasingly personal and inappropriate questions, making comments about the guard's family, his intelligence, his worth as a human being. Each insult was delivered with a smile, as if cruelty could be made acceptable by packaging it as entertainment. Morrison's hands, hidden behind his back in regulation position, slowly clenched into fists. Not from anger at the reporter, but from the tremendous effort it was taking to maintain his composure. Every instinct honed by years of military service was telling him to respond, to defend his honor and the honor of his fallen comrades. But his duty demanded silence, and duty had always been Morrison's highest priority. The guard's mind went to a memory from Afghanistan, where he had held a dying soldier in his arms while enemy bullets flew overhead. That young man, barely 20 years old, had whispered with his last breath about how proud he was to serve, how he believed their sacrifice meant something. Morrison had made a promise that day to honor that soldier's memory by never letting anything diminish the dignity of their service. Now, standing in front of Buckingham Palace, while a reporter mocked everything he held sacred, Morrison drew strength. From that promise, he would not break. He would not give this ignorant man the satisfaction of a reaction. He would maintain his dignity even if it meant enduring humiliation. But the crowd was reaching a breaking point. Eleanor Whitfield had heard enough. She began pushing through the tourists, her grandson following close behind, trying to stop her. Other veterans in the crowd were beginning to recognize what was happening, and their faces showed a mixture of anger and disgust that Marcus was too self-absorbed to notice. The confrontation was about to take a turn that would expose not just the reporter's cruelty, but his complete failure to understand the character of the man he was tormenting. Eleanor Whitfield had finally pushed her way to the front of the crowd, her grandson Michael reluctantly following behind. Her aged hands gripped her walking stick tightly as she positioned herself within earshot of Marcus. She had remained silent for as long as she could, but watching the young reporter mock a soldier had awakened memories and emotions she couldn't suppress any longer. "Excuse me, young man," she called out in a voice that carried the authority of her 78 years. Marcus turned toward her, initially annoyed by the interruption but quickly recognizing an opportunity for more content. "Yes, ma'am?" he said, flashing his television smile and gesturing for Dave to turn the camera toward her. "Would you like to share your thoughts about our friend here?" He nodded toward Sergeant Morrison, who remained motionless despite the growing chaos around him. Eleanor studied Marcus's face for a moment, seeing something there that reminded her of the bullies she had encountered during her long life. There was a smugness, a casual cruelty that she recognized and despised. "I'd like to tell you about a young soldier I knew during the war," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "He was about the age of that guard you've been mocking. His name was Tommy, and he was my brother." Marcus sensed this might be good television and encouraged her to continue, not realizing he was about to be outmaneuvered by someone with far more life experience and wisdom than he possessed. "Tommy stood guard duty too," Eleanor continued. "Not at a palace, but at a military base outside London during the Blitz. Night after night he stood at his post while German bombs fell around him. His job was to watch for enemy aircraft and raise the alarm so civilians like me could get to safety." The crowd around them had grown quiet, drawn in by Eleanor's story. Even Marcus found himself listening, though he was already thinking about how to spin this for maximum impact. One night, a bomb fell very close to Tommy's position. The blast knocked him down, broke his leg, and filled his eyes with debris so he could barely see. "But do you know what he did?" Eleanor's voice grew stronger. "He got back up. He stayed at his post, because he knew that if he abandoned his duty, people would die." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, beginning to sense that this conversation wasn't going the direction he had hoped. "That's a very touching story," he said, trying to regain control of the narrative. "But that was wartime. This is just ceremony, just tradition. It's not the same thing at all." Eleanor's eyes flashed with an anger that made several people in Diaz Otoida. The crowd stepped back slightly. "You think it's not the same? You think standing guard is only meaningful when bullets are flying? That guard you've been tormenting has probably seen more combat than my brother ever did. The uniform is the same, the duty is the same, and the honor is the same." Michael watched his grandmother with a mixture of pride and concern. He had never seen her this passionate about anything, and he could tell she was just getting started. "But here's what I really want you to understand," Eleanor continued, addressing Marcus but speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "My brother Tommy came home from the war a changed man. He had nightmares, he drank too much, he couldn't hold down a job. We didn't have a name for it then, but now we'd call it post-traumatic stress disorder." She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering her next point. "Tommy used to tell me that the hardest part of his service wasn't the bombs or the fear of dying. It was coming home to people who had no idea what he'd been through, people who looked at his uniform and saw either a hero or a fool, but never just a man who had done his duty. People who thought they could judge him without knowing his story." Marcus was beginning to realize that he had seriously underestimated this elderly woman. The crowd was hanging on her every word, and the dynamic of his broadcast was shifting away from his control. "You've spent the last hour trying to provoke that young man," Eleanor said, pointing toward Morrison with her walking stick. "You've mocked his service, questioned his intelligence, and treated him like he's some kind of performing animal. And through it all, he has shown more dignity and self-control than you've shown in your entire performance here today." The criticism stung, but Marcus's pride wouldn't let him back down. "Look, I respect military service," he said defensively. "But standing around in a costume for tourists isn't exactly storming the beaches of Normandy, is it?" Eleanor's expression grew cold. "How do you know what he's done? How do you know where he's served or what he's sacrificed? You see a uniform and assume you know everything about the man wearing it. That's not journalism, young man. That's ignorance." Behind them, Sergeant Morrison continued to stand at attention, but those close enough could see the slight tension in his jaw. Eleanor's words were having an impact on him as well, though not in the way Marcus expected. The guard wasn't angry at being defended. Instead, he was moved by the recognition from someone who understood the weight of military service. Sarah, the producer, was watching the social media feeds with growing alarm. The tone of the comments had shifted dramatically since Eleanor began speaking. Viewers were turning against Marcus, calling him disrespectful and unprofessional. Worse, some were beginning to research his background, digging up information about his privileged upbringing and lack of any real hardship or service in his own life. "Marcus," she whispered urgently during a brief lull in the conversation. "We need to wrap this up. The comments are getting ugly." But Marcus was too proud and too angry to listen. Eleanor had made him look foolish in front of his audience, and his ego demanded that he fight back. He was about to make the mistake that would define the rest of his career. "Listen, lady," he said, his television politeness finally cracking to reveal the arrogance underneath. "I appreciate your family history, but I'm a professional journalist. I've studied these ceremonies, I've done my research, and I know what I'm talking about. This is theater, not military service." Eleanor smiled sadly, recognizing the moment when Marcus revealed his true character to everyone watching. "Professional journalist?" she repeated. "Then perhaps you can explain to your viewers how a professional journalist can spend an hour trying to humiliate someone without even bothering to learn their name, their background, or their story." The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. In all his preparation and research, he had never once thought to find out anything about the individual guards he would encounter. He had seen them as props, not people. And now his oversight was being exposed in front of thousands of viewers. Eleanor wasn't finished. She had one more revelation that would completely destroy Marcus's credibility and expose the depth of his ignorance and prejudice. Eleanor Whitfield reached into her small purse and pulled out her mobile phone, moving with surprising agility for someone her age. Michael watched with growing amazement as his grandmother navigated to what appeared to be a news article. "Since you claim to be such a thorough researcher," Eleanor said to Marcus, her voice carrying a new edge of authority, "perhaps you'd be interested to know exactly who you've been trying to humiliate for the past hour." She held up her phone, showing the screen to Marcus and positioning it so Dave's camera could capture it as well. The headline read, "Local hero returns from Afghanistan. Sergeant James Morrison awarded Military Cross for extraordinary bravery." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face as Eleanor began reading from the article. Sergeant James Morrison, aged 32, of the Welsh Guards, has been awarded the Military Cross for conspicuous gallantry during operations in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. On October 15th, Sergeant Morrison led a rescue mission to extract wounded soldiers from a position under heavy enemy fire. Despite being wounded himself, he carried 2 injured comrades to safety and returned to the battlefield to recover the body of a fallen soldier, ensuring no one was left behind. The crowd around them had fallen completely silent. Even the tourists, who didn't fully understand the military significance of what Eleanor was reading, could sense the gravity of the moment. Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. The citation goes on to say that Sergeant Morrison's actions that day saved the lives of 4 soldiers and demonstrated leadership and courage of the highest order. He has completed 3 tours of duty in active combat zones and has been recommended for promotion based on his exceptional service record. Marcus stood frozen, his microphone hanging limply in his hand. Every joke he had made, every insult he had delivered, every moment of mockery now seemed not just inappropriate, but genuinely disgusting. He had spent an hour trying to break down a man who had literally risked his life to save others. "But that's not all," Eleanor said, scrolling through her phone. "It seems our Sergeant Morrison here has quite an impressive background. Before his military service, he earned a degree in engineering from Cambridge University. After his first tour in Afghanistan, he spent his leave time volunteering with a charity that helps homeless veterans find housing and employment." The crowd was beginning to murmur, and Marcus could hear anger in their voices. Someone called out, "Shame on you!" from the back, and others began to echo the sentiment. Eleanor wasn't done revealing the depth of Marcus's ignorance. According to this article, Sergeant Morrison turned down several job offers from private engineering firms after university because he felt called to serve his country. He has donated his military bonuses to families of fallen soldiers and has mentored dozens of young recruits. Sarah was frantically signaling to Marcus to end the broadcast, but he seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of his mistake. The viewer comments were now overwhelmingly critical, and several major news outlets were already picking up the story. What had started as Marcus's attempt at viral fame was quickly becoming a viral disaster. Michael, Eleanor's grandson, finally found his voice. "Nan, how did you know all this?" Eleanor smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. "Because I actually took the time to research the story properly. When I heard this young reporter was going to be covering the guard ceremony, I looked up who would be on duty today. It took me about 10 minutes on the internet to learn more about Sergeant Morrison than this professional journalist bothered to discover in all his preparation." The rebuke was devastating in its simplicity. Eleanor had done what Marcus should have done as a basic part of his job, and her preparation had exposed his complete failure as a journalist. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper. I didn't know." "Of course you didn't know," Eleanor replied. "Because you didn't want to know. You wanted a story about silly soldiers playing dress-up, so that's all you looked for. You never bothered to consider that the man under that uniform might have a story worth telling, might have experiences worth respecting." The crowd was pressing closer now, and Marcus could see phones pointed at him from every direction. His humiliation was being recorded from multiple angles, ensuring that his shame would be preserved forever. Dave, the cameraman, finally made the decision that Marcus couldn't bring himself to make. He stopped recording and began packing up his equipment, clearly wanting to distance himself from what was rapidly becoming a career-ending disaster. But Sergeant Morrison remained perfectly still throughout the entire confrontation. Even as his story was being told, even as he was being vindicated, he maintained his professional composure. His discipline held firm, his duty remained his priority, and his dignity stayed intact. Eleanor noticed the guard's unwavering stance and felt a surge of respect for the young man. She turned away from Marcus and addressed Morrison directly, even though she knew he couldn't respond. "Sergeant Morrison," she said formally, "on behalf of grateful citizens who understand the value of your service, I want to thank you. Thank you for your sacrifice. Thank you for your courage, and thank you for showing us today what true strength looks like." The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. Tourists, locals, veterans, and ordinary citizens who had witnessed Marcus's behavior all joined in, showing their appreciation for the guard and their disapproval of the reporter's conduct. Marcus stood there, surrounded by applause that wasn't for him, watching as his career crumbled around him. But the worst was yet to come. Eleanor had one final revelation that would expose not just his poor journalism, but his fundamental character flaws that had made this disaster inevitable. The elderly woman turned back to Marcus with an expression of profound disappointment. "You know what the saddest part of all this is? You had the opportunity to tell an amazing story today. You could have researched Sergeant Morrison's background, interviewed him after his duty shift, and shared his incredible journey from university student to decorated war hero to ceremonial guard. You could have educated people about the real men and women behind these uniforms. She paused, letting the weight of his missed opportunity sink in. Instead, you chose to be cruel. You chose to mock and humiliate because you thought it would be entertaining. That tells me everything I need to know about what kind of person you are and what kind of journalist you'll never be. The truth of her words hit Marcus harder than any professional criticism ever could. She was right, and he knew it. His behavior hadn't been driven by journalistic curiosity or even ignorance. It had been driven by a mean-spirited desire to tear someone down for the entertainment of others. He had revealed his own character, and it was uglier than he had ever imagined. The atmosphere around Buckingham Palace had completely transformed. What had begun as a routine tourist attraction had become something far more significant. Word of the confrontation was spreading rapidly through social media, and more people were arriving to witness what had become a spontaneous demonstration of respect for military service. Marcus Chen stood in the middle of it all, isolated and humiliated. The crowd that had initially been entertained by his antics now looked at him with undisguised contempt. He could hear whispered conversations around him, people sharing what they had just learned about Sergeant Morrison's background and expressing their disgust at how the reporter had behaved. Sarah, his producer, had disappeared entirely. She had received urgent calls from the network executives who were already in damage control mode. The story was trending on social media, but not in the way they had hoped. Respect the Guard and shameful journalism were both climbing the trending lists, with thousands of people sharing their outrage at Marcus's behavior. Dave, the cameraman, finished packing his equipment and approached Marcus reluctantly. "I'm sorry, mate," he said quietly. "I can't be associated with this anymore. This has gone too far." He walked away, leaving Marcus completely alone in front of the crowd that had turned against him. For the first time in his life, the ambitious young reporter understood what it felt like to be truly powerless, to have his reputation and future hanging by a thread. Eleanor Whitfield watched him with a mixture of pity and disappointment. Her grandson Michael stood beside her, struggling to process what he had witnessed. As a journalism student, he had been taught about the importance of research, integrity, and respect for subjects. Watching Marcus's spectacular failure had been like witnessing a masterclass in how not to practice journalism. "Nan," Michael whispered, "how did you know to research the Guard beforehand?" Eleanor smiled sadly. "Because that's what you do when you respect people enough to tell their stories properly. You learn about them. You understand their experiences. You treat them as human beings worthy of dignity." She glanced toward Sergeant Morrison, who continued to stand at his post with unwavering discipline. "That young man has probably seen things that would give you nightmares for the rest of your life. He's made sacrifices that most people can't even imagine. The least anyone can do is treat him with the respect he's earned." Meanwhile, Marcus was beginning to grasp the full scope of his disaster. His phone was buzzing constantly with notifications. Some were from colleagues expressing their shock and disappointment. Others were from family members who had seen the viral videos and were horrified by his behavior. But most were from strangers, expressing their anger and promising to boycott anything associated with him or his network. The worst part was reading the comments from military personnel and veterans. These weren't just angry reactions. They were deeply personal expressions of hurt and betrayal. Soldiers who had served alongside people like Sergeant Morrison were sharing their own stories, explaining what it felt like to have their service mocked and diminished by someone who had never risked anything for his country. One comment, particularly, stung. "My son died serving his country in Afghanistan. He was 22 years old and believed he was fighting for people's freedom to live safely. Watching this reporter mock a soldier who probably served with honor beside my boy makes me sick." This is what my son died for? So spoiled brats can humiliate heroes for entertainment? Marcus had to put his phone away. The weight of what he had done was becoming unbearable, but the crowd around Buckingham Palace wasn't dispersing. Instead, something remarkable was happening. Veterans were arriving, some in uniform, others wearing unit patches or military insignia. Word had spread through veteran networks, and they were coming to show support for Sergeant Morrison and to demonstrate their disapproval of how he had been treated. A woman in her 50s approached the barrier near Morrison's position. She wore a Royal Navy veteran's jacket and carried herself with military bearing. She stood at attention and saluted the guard, holding the position for several seconds before speaking. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant," she said formally, "and thank you for showing us today what honor looks like." Others followed her example. One by one, veterans and active-duty military personnel who had heard about the incident began arriving to pay their respects. They formed an impromptu honor guard around Morrison's position, standing in solidarity with their fellow soldier. The scene was deeply moving, but it also served to further highlight Marcus's shameful behavior. The contrast between his mockery and their respect was stark and damning. A senior officer in dress uniform approached the area. This was Colonel Patricia Davies, Morrison's commanding officer, who had received word about the incident and had come personally to assess the situation. She surveyed the scene, taking in the crowd of supporters, the obviously distressed reporter, and her soldier standing perfectly at his post despite the chaos around him. Colonel Davies had served for 28 years and had seen many things. But the sight of civilians spontaneously gathering to honor one of her soldiers filled her with pride. She also felt fury at the reporter who had tried to humiliate a decorated hero, but her anger was controlled and purposeful. She approached Marcus directly, her bearing making it clear that she was not someone to be trifled with. "You are Marcus Chen, I believe," she said, her voice carrying the authority of decades of military leadership. Marcus nodded, unable to find his voice. "I am Colonel Davies, Sergeant Morrison's commanding officer. I understand you've been having quite a conversation with my soldier today." The word conversation was delivered with enough ice to freeze water, making it clear that she knew exactly what had transpired. "I want you to understand something, Mr. Chen," the colonel continued. "That man has served his country with distinction in 3 combat zones. He has saved lives, led men through impossible situations, and earned the respect of everyone who has had the honor of serving with him. He is currently assigned to ceremonial duties as a recognition of his exemplary service record." Marcus tried to speak, to offer some kind of apology or explanation, but Colonel Davies held up a hand to silence him. "I'm not finished. What you've done here today isn't just disrespectful to Sergeant Morrison, it's disrespectful to every person who has ever worn a uniform, every family who has sacrificed for military service, and every citizen who has benefited from the protection that soldiers provide." The crowd around them had grown quiet, listening to every word the colonel spoke. "But most importantly," she continued, "you've revealed something about yourself that I think you're only now beginning to understand. You've shown everyone watching what it looks like when someone mistakes cruelty for cleverness, ignorance for insight, and cowardice for courage." The final word hit Marcus like a physical blow. Cowardice. It was the one accusation that cut deepest, because deep down, he knew it was true. Colonel Davies wasn't finished with Marcus. Her years of military leadership had taught her the importance of teachable moments, and she recognized that this situation had the potential to educate not just the reporter, but everyone watching, about what military service really meant. "Mr. Chen," she continued, "I'm going to tell you something that might help you understand the magnitude of your error today. Sergeant Morrison volunteered for his 3rd tour in Afghanistan when he could, have stayed safely in England. Do you know why?" Marcus shook his head, his face pale and his confidence completely shattered. "Because one of his soldiers, a 19-year-old private named Danny Walsh, was killed by an improvised explosive device during their 2nd deployment. Sergeant Morrison blamed himself, even though everyone else knew there was nothing he could have done. He requested to return, because he felt he owed it to Danny's memory to continue the mission they had started together. The colonel's words carried the weight of genuine emotion, and the crowd around them listened in complete silence. During that third tour, Sergeant Morrison was wounded twice. The second time, shrapnel from a mortar round left him with permanent damage to his left leg. He walks with pain every day, though he'll never complain about it. Standing at attention for hours in ceremonial duties isn't easy for him, but he does it because he believes in the honor of service. Marcus felt physically sick. Every joke he had made about the guard's posture, every mocking comment about standing still, took on a new and horrible significance. He had been ridiculing a man who was enduring physical pain as part of his duty. Eleanor Whitfield stepped forward, her grandson Michael still beside her. "Colonel Davies, if I may," she said respectfully, "I think it's important that everyone here understands what we've all witnessed today." The colonel nodded, recognizing a kindred spirit in the elderly woman, who had first confronted Marcus. "We've seen two very different examples of character," Eleanor continued, addressing the crowd, but speaking loudly enough for Marcus to hear every word. "We've seen a young man who thought he could build his career by tearing down someone else, who confused cruelty with cleverness and mockery with journalism." She paused, looking directly at Marcus. "But we've also seen what real strength looks like. Sergeant Morrison could have responded to the insults. He could have defended himself, could have put this reporter in his place with a few choice words. He has the knowledge, the experience, and certainly the right to do so." The crowd murmured agreement, many people nodding as they understood Eleanor's point. But he didn't. Not because he couldn't, but because he chose not to. He chose to maintain his dignity, to honor his duty, and to show us all what it means to take the high road even when someone is trying to drag you down. Sergeant Morrison remained at his post, but those close enough could see the slight softening around his eyes. The recognition and respect from these civilians meant more to him than they could know. Colonel Davies nodded approvingly at Eleanor's words. "Mrs. Whitfield makes an excellent point. What you've witnessed today, ladies and gentlemen, is the difference between someone who talks about strength and someone who actually possesses it." She turned back to Marcus, her expression stern, but not without compassion. "Mr. Chen, you have a choice to make now. You can learn from this experience, or you can let it destroy you. You can choose to become a better person and a better journalist, or you can remain the same shallow, cruel individual you've shown yourself to be today." Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't understand." "No, you didn't," the colonel agreed. "But ignorance isn't an excuse for cruelty. You had the opportunity to learn about Sergeant Morrison before you ever approached him. You chose not to because it suited your purposes, to see him as less than human." The harsh truth of her words hung in the air. Marcus realized that his apology, while genuine, was too little and too late. The damage had been done, not just to his career, but to his understanding of himself. Michael, Eleanor's grandson, had been quiet throughout most of the confrontation, but now he stepped forward. As a journalism student, he felt compelled to speak. "Mr. Chen," he said, "I'm studying to be a journalist. What you did today, that's not journalism. That's just bullying with a camera. Real journalism is about telling important stories, giving voice to people who might not otherwise be heard, and helping society understand itself better." His words stung because they came from someone young enough to be Marcus's peer, someone who understood the profession Marcus claimed to represent. "You had the chance to tell an incredible story today," Michael continued. "You could have interviewed Sergeant Morrison after his duty shift, learned about his experiences, and shared his journey with your audience. You could have educated people about what modern military service really looks like, about the men and women who volunteer to put themselves in harm's way for their country. He paused, looking around at the crowd of veterans and civilians who had gathered to support Morrison. Instead, you chose to mock and humiliate because you thought it would be entertaining. You turned a decorated war hero into a punchline for your own amusement. That's not just bad journalism. It's a betrayal of everything journalism should stand for. The crowd erupted in applause, clearly agreeing with Michael's assessment. Marcus stood there, absorbing the criticism from someone young enough to remind him of his own aspirations when he had first entered journalism school. As the afternoon wore on, the incident continued to spread across social media and news outlets. Videos of the confrontation were being shared millions of times, but the narrative had shifted completely from Marcus's original intent. Instead of going viral as a clever reporter getting reactions from stoic guards, the story became about a callous journalist being schooled by an elderly woman and a decorated soldier who never said a word. News anchors were discussing the incident on evening broadcasts. Military advocates were using it as an example of civilian misunderstanding of military service, and journalism professors were assigning it as a case study in professional ethics. Marcus's network released a statement distancing themselves from his behavior and announcing his immediate suspension pending a full investigation. His colleagues avoided him, his friends stopped returning his calls, and his family expressed their disappointment and shame. But perhaps the most devastating consequence was what Marcus saw when he looked in the mirror. The incident had forced him to confront the person he had become, someone who thought cruelty was clever and humiliation was entertainment. He realized that his behavior toward Sergeant Morrison wasn't an aberration, it was a pattern. He had built his approach to journalism on finding weakness in others and exploiting it for his own gain. Sergeant Morrison finished his duty shift that evening with the same professionalism and dignity he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. As he was relieved by the next guard, he finally allowed himself a small smile. Not because his tormentor had been defeated, but because so many people had stood up for what was right. The incident became known as the Buckingham Palace lesson, a reminder that real strength isn't found in the ability to tear others down, but in the discipline to maintain one's dignity even under attack. It became a teaching moment about the difference between mockery and journalism, between cruelty and courage, and between taking the easy path and taking the right path. Marcus Chen eventually left journalism entirely, unable to rebuild his reputation after the incident. But in a strange way, his public humiliation served a greater purpose. It reminded society about the importance of respecting those who serve, the value of doing proper research before making judgments, and the power of maintaining dignity in the face of adversity. Sergeant Morrison continued his service with honor, eventually being promoted and taking on training responsibilities for new recruits. He often told them about the day at Buckingham Palace, not as a story of how he was wronged, but as an example of how maintaining discipline and dignity in difficult situations can have a positive impact far beyond what you might imagine. Eleanor Whitfield became something of a celebrity herself, invited to speak about respect for military service and the importance of understanding history. She always ended her talks with the same message. Real strength isn't about overpowering others. It's about maintaining your principles when it would be easier to abandon them. The incident showed everyone who witnessed it the difference between someone who talks about strength and someone who actually possesses it. In the end, the guard's silence spoke louder than the reporter's words ever could.